socioeconomist, works at LERPEPS, or Studies and Research Laboratory in Economics, Policy and Social System at Toulouse University. And during this lecture, she'll talk about the water issue in Indonesia. And before starting, I would like to thank EVO as the co-organization, Komunitas Historia Indonesia that promote our event, and also Catherine for being here. And this presentation will be in English and will last around 40 minutes. And there is a discussion afterward. So do not hesitate to ask questions in both Indonesian and English. I will translate the Indonesian part. And after the conference, there will be some light refreshment outside that you could discuss with Catherine informally outside. Thank you, and the place is yours, Catherine.
Sorry, I'm not used to talk with a microphone on a stage, just in front of all these people. So thank you for being here. I wanted to first introduce myself. As Fito said, I'm a socio-economist, and I'm making this presentation on a common good, water as a common good. I would like to say first that I just started research on Indonesia. In fact, I don't know Indonesia very well. I started a year ago to work here, and I'm much more familiar with water issues in Africa. So maybe the comparison is interesting to make. I will focus my presentation on Indonesia, but I'm very, very pleased to discuss with you because maybe you know much more than me about water issues in your own country. So I wanted to start like this. The second point I want to stress out is that my presentation will focus on water qualification. In fact, what is water? This is the main question, the main issue of my presentation. Is water a private good? Is water a public or social good? Is water a right? What is water, in fact? And according to your point of view, you can define and qualify water very differently. And then I will focus only on discourse analysis. I'm what we call an institutional economist. So I focus on how the rules are made, how they are implemented, how they are discussed or not, and how all this works throughout the discourse of politicians, researchers, NGOs, all these actors, all the stakeholders in a public water policy who decide the rules. And this is my key point of view. And I won't discuss about practices. I'm sorry, it's a choice I made because I don't, as I told you, I just started my fieldwork here in Indonesia. So I don't want to talk about things that I don't know very well. Next, please. So the context. I will be very quickly on the context. As you know, in 2015, it was the end of the Millennium Development Goals, and there was a big issue on water. In the MDG, water was not mentioned as a key issue. It was very strange to consider this. Water was among one of the big objectives, but it was a kind of hidden in other objectives. So there was a lot of lobbying from different actors trying to make water at the core of all the international debates. And the SDGs were very wanted to focus on water issues. So if we look at one report, which is one of the main reports on water issues, which is JMP, what we see here, I'm not going to stress out all the figures, but just to stress out that water issues is still a key issue. In fact, most of the objectives have not been reached, even if in some papers you can read that many of the objectives are reached. Well, if you focus on the detail, you can see that it's quite optimistic, let's say like this. And if you look at Indonesia, what I found quite interesting to note was that it was very difficult to find the information, very precise information on all these data, on water data in Indonesia. So I found some in JMP, and I just put this one because it's an interesting one. In Indonesia, 89% of people used an improved water source. I explain what it is after. But, and this is very specific compared with my fieldwork in Africa, only 14% of people have tap water at home. So this is, for me, a very interesting issue. Next, please. And if we consider a JMP report, Indonesia is supposed to reach the SDG by 2030. So this is quite also optimistic. And you can see on the right inside, I put this red circle, that Indonesia will be one of the few countries reaching SDG. Next. So why is water so important? It's because water is at the core of many, many issues. As you know, food security, poverty, health, education, gender too, energy, biodiversity, and also linked with climate change. So whatever you're discussing about, water is always at the core of the debates. So that's why I think it's very interesting to have a look on water issues. Next. So my presentation will be organized around 3 issues that I would like to discuss with you. The first one is more, it's not theoretical, but it's just to see how researchers define water and what are the debates on these definitions. The second one is, it will be a very quick one, is water qualification in international conferences. And what I want to stress out is, what does it mean that we consider water as a common good? And does this definition of water as a common good a key issue for international conferences? And then, on the third point, I hope I have time. This is the one that the less familiar with and that you know better than I do, is, as you know, as I told you, I'm trying to analyze the impact of water qualification on institutional rules. And there is something which is very interesting in Indonesia, is a debate around the water law. So I would like to just show you how I can read the process of the law, the definition, cancellation, and the new law through this framework, conceptual framework about qualification. Okay, is that clear? Is it okay? Yes? Okay, so next one. So the first one is, how can we define water? So next. As I told you, I'm an economist at the beginning, long time ago, and I started by this framework, that in economics, when we want to define goods, any kind of goods, we have 2 criteria to define these goods. And this is in the economic literature, from Samuelson, who was a very American famous economist, to Ostrom, maybe you know, because she got the Nobel Prize, and she wrote a famous paper with her husband. And in these papers, they decided to define goods through 2 criteria. One criteria is the criteria of exclusion. What does it mean? It means that a good is excludable if you can prevent someone from using it, from consuming it. And there is another criteria, which is rivalry. And a good is rival when its consumption by someone can reduce the quantity which is available for the consumption of other people. So I explain more precisely. I give you some example. For instance, they define, thanks to these criteria, 4 kinds of goods. And these are the 4 kinds of goods that you can find everywhere. First one is private good. You all know private good. Private good, for instance, it's a car, What does it mean, exclusion and rivalry? If you have your own car, it means that your neighbor cannot have this same car, and that if you drive it, you exclude the people from driving it. Okay, so it's very easy. It's both criteria of excludability and rivalry. There are also what we call club goods. Club goods, it means that to get access to this kind of goods, there are specific rules. For instance, you have to pay, and if you pay, you can get access to these goods, but the others who didn't pay cannot get access to this. For example, a football club, or a club where you can go and others cannot go that easily if they don't get the right to get access to this club. Okay? There is another kind of good that you know also, which is public good. What does public good mean? Public goods, it means that there is no rivalry, no exclusion. For instance, if you have lightning in the street, lightning is a street, public lightnings, for example, if you walk on the street, but it doesn't prevent your neighbor to get this same light as you have, okay? And so there is no rivalry and no exclusion. Everyone can, if you walk in the street, you can have the same opportunity than everyone. It is called public. Why? Because this kind of goods cannot be produced, we think, by individuals, cannot be produced by a new enterprise, a private actor. So these kind of goods have to be built by public authorities. Okay, so this is public goods. And there is the last one, which is a more complicated one, which is common good. How do we explain common good? So this is Ostrom who defined this category of common good, which is non-exclusion and rivalry. What does that mean? For instance, she took a very particular example, which is fisheries, ocean fisheries. And what does that mean? That means that if you are in the ocean, if there is no specific law, no specific international law, of course, you can go and fish, and everyone can go and fish in this neighborhood. So you can catch fish. But if you catch a fish, it means that this fish will not be available anymore for your neighbor, for someone else. So it's non-exclusion, but it's rivalry. Okay? So in fact, it's very easy with the economist, always. It's very concrete, and we can say that we have all these kind of goods. So what did we try to do is to say that this framework works for water. Can we explain water through these 4 different categories? That's what we tried to do. So it's the next slide, please. So what could we do? We could say that what is a private good? Okay, private good, for instance, is this bottle of water. Okay, very easy. This bottle of water seems to be, there is exclusion and rivalry. If I buy it, I drink it, you cannot drink it, and it's my own property. Okay, so it has something to see also with property rights. What is a club good? This is much more difficult. What is a club good according to water? For instance, is tap water a club good? Because when you have tap water, you have to pay your bill. So if you don't pay your bill, you're excluded from this good. But it's not rivalry. If there is enough water, but this is a condition, if you have enough water, you can get access, and your neighbor could have access to this water. So tap water could be considered as a club good. Public good. What is public good? Okay, you know all public good. For instance, free water hydrants can be considered as a public good, as it is non-exclusion and non-rivalry. It is produced by the state or the government or local government, and if it's free, there is no exclusion. Okay? You can also have the network. The network can be considered also as a public good. But Ostrom, the author I mentioned just before, defined this category of common good for water, especially for water. because she did a lot of works in developing countries, mainly in developing countries, and she showed in her work that if you consider some water resources, just like lakes, fisheries, aquifers, irrigation, she worked a lot on irrigation, what do you see? You see that sometimes there is no exclusion. All the people can get access to these water goods. And there is rivalry because if you use it, the other cannot use it. Okay? So this framework could work on water issues, but the problem is that sometimes the water can go from one to another definition of these four representations in qualification of water. Okay, next, please. But if we just consider qualification, we don't consider the way these goods are managed, are governed. And if you can theoretically define these goods, how can you define the way these goods have to be managed? So in fact, what is the link between qualification and management? I would say governance, but let's say management to be more easy. And this is now this is the way that we can discuss all these categories and see that these categories are not enough to think the qualification of water. When you think about water, you have to think about qualification, but also management. You can define qualification in a technical way, economic way, but when you are discussing about governance and management, it's a much more political way to define this. And this is more complicated. For instance, if you have a private good, okay, if you say private good, you say Danone produces this private good. So it's a private enterprise which produces a private good. But it's not that obvious. For instance, in Indonesia, I've been working in Solo, for instance, and we have seen that PDM, which is a public enterprise, can also produce a private good. So it's not only private good leading to private management. Okay? If we look to a club good, for instance, tap water, what did we see? Okay, we can say that tap water is managed by public authorities or by PPP, you know, for instance, in Jakarta, until now. Or you have some cases of complete privatization. And privatization is not PPP. Privatization means that the enterprise owns everything, the network, everything. So everything is privatized, and not only a delegation contract. Public goods. Public goods, it's the same. Public goods, does it mean public management? Not all the time. And in Indonesia, sometimes the infrastructure is owned by the state, by local authorities, but the management is given to communities, local communities, or to public authorities. So what I mean here is that it's very difficult to say that if we have a specific water qualification, we can have an automatic way of managing the good. Okay? For common pool resource, common good, it's quite different because with the definition of a good as a common good, it refers to a specific way of governing the commons. The famous book of Ostrom was Governing the Commons, because she showed in her book that in these cases, you have more community-based management. So when you define water as a common good, one of the main management way to manage these resources should be community-based management. Okay, is that okay? So next, please. So in fact, what I mean here is that water management, it's a kind of hybrid system. It's a kind of hybridation of different management modes throughout the whole water process, which can be extraction, treatment, storage, or distribution. But it's not only distribution. And very often we make the confusion and we consider that all these items are the same. but they are very different. And for instance, in Indonesia, there is a big debate on the efficiency of the public centralized network managed by PDM. And when you are looking on the fieldwork, you can see that there are many alternatives to this system, which can be community-based water management, for instance, community deep wells, which can be hybrid management, what I call hybrid management, PPP, just like in Jakarta with Palija, or private management with bottling water, but also informal water resellers. That can be this kind of private management too. So, next one, please. So it's a very difficult and very tricky issues than to try to define qualification related to water management. I wanted to make just a focus on, as it's the title of my conference, a focus on common resources. What is a common good? In fact, I'm not going to read all this, but just to stress out the point that the key issue with common resources is the way people get coordinated, the way people get organized all together. And there are two ways to think about this issue. Whether you consider the people as selfish people, and you think that all the people will act according to their own interest. This is not at all the way that common management consider the way that people get coordinated. For the what we call common pool resource, the people, they consider that communities can get organized themselves and that they elaborate their own rules at their level. And this is what Ostrom mentioned when she talked about common goods. She talked of a third way between public and private management. And she stressed out the fact that in many communities that she worked on, she could figure out all the rules, the endogenous rules that the communities elaborated by themselves. And so she did a lot of case studies all around the world, in India, in Africa, in Asia, everywhere, in South America. And she tried to find some criteria to discuss and to show when the common pool resource management could succeed. And she defined these 8 criteria, which are very well known in the literature, which are, to be successful, the limits of the groups are to be clearly defined. And very often, these are small groups. Is it possible? So one of the questions is to ask, is it possible to think about a common resource management at a very global level? It's very difficult. So is it just a local initiatives, or can we think about common pool resource management at a level of a city, for instance? It's not that sure. Second criteria is that rules must match with local conditions. As the people are elaborating their own rules, these rules have to fit with social, cultural, political, local conditions. The third criteria is that the one who are affected by all these rules, this is the one that can modify these rules and not outside people. Another one is that trying to find out the way to monitor these rules, but still inside the community and not outside. There must be sanctions if the rules are not comment on dit en français en anglais? Respected, merci. There must be sanctions, but who decide the sanctions? Once again, Ostrom said that the communities have to define their own sanction. The sanction must not be defined outside the community. This is a point. I wrote it like this, but in fact, Ostrom doesn't introduce that clearly the idea of conflict in her studies. And this is one of the weak points of her studies. She considered that in the communities, well, as they define their rules, as they discuss their rules together, there is no conflict. And in fact, when you study all these small groups elaborating their own rules, etc., there is hierarchy. There is not governance, horizontal power relationships. There is a lot of hierarchy, and I think we have to discuss about this. And then, so you have to think about conflict resolution mechanism, and this is not the easy part. But if these rules are elaborated at the local level, it doesn't mean that local authorities, local public authorities, for instance, are excluded of this process. So at some times, there is a recognition by local public authorities of the collective rules that are elaborated by all these communities. So it means that they interact and they discuss together the elaboration of the rules of the community. Excuse me. Okay, I leave maybe polycentric governance, it's more complicated. It means that all the levels are embedded, local, national, international, which means that there are always interaction between all these levels. And this is one of the weak points also of this analysis, because it's very difficult to think the embeddedness of all these different levels. So, what is a common? Okay, you understood all the conceptual framework. But now if we are looking on the field, what can we say? And what is very interesting in Indonesia, I found, is that there is a debate in Indonesia, which is not in Africa, for instance, between different types of water resources. And we can see that there are issues, debates, and especially on the law, about what is really the water that we want to put rules on. Is it spring sources? Can we use spring sources as if it was just a free good, which is open to everyone? What about surface water? Can we use this surface water? Is it a common good? Is it a private good? Or is it a good which is accessible to everyone without any rules? Or groundwater? Okay, if you have if you take water in your garden, okay, is it okay? Can you take it as you want? Or are there some rules to give you the opportunity or to take this water out of the ground? So there is, I think, a real debate on what is common water, what is water as a common, according to each of these qualification of water. Thank you. Again, next, please. So what we try to figure out here is to see that in Indonesia, we try to look at the law, and we found that there is an ambiguity between common good, the definition of water as a common good, and community-based management. And there is also a gap between discourses in the law, for instance, and practices. If we look at the governmental and decentralized level, community-based management is widely promoted. In fact, in Indonesia, it was very interesting to look at all the text, the institutional arguments and all this, and to see that community participation should be engaged in every aspect of development. So it means that if we read the text, communities have a real voice. And this we worked also on urban issues, and we found the same recommendations. There is this big program that you know probably 100-0-100, which is 100 access to water, 0 slums, and 100% of access to sanitation. And here in this program also, water infrastructures management is delegated to communities, especially in slums. So there is a really a will to have this community-based management. But as I told you, community-based management doesn't mean that you consider water as a common good. But there is very often a confusion. And if you look at the water resource law, there is this confusion between water as a common and the one you have just above as community-based water management. For instance, in this sentence, in this article, traditional rights of the local traditional law communities on water resource will be recognized, but as long as they actually exist and has been confirmed with local regulation. So this is an ambiguous one. So there are all these debates and some words which are some discourses that would let us think that water is considered as a common with a community-based management, but in fact, in the law, you can see that it's more ambiguous. And what is interesting in this is that you can interpret, in fact, all these words in one sense or another. And what I mean here is that it's a political debate. Political not in the sense that it is politicians, political in sense of this is the way you want your society to be governed, and which is behind all this. Next, please. Okay, you can go next. I go further. Next. Water can be also all these technical devices, which means that very often when you don't want to discuss about the political issues, you just look at how technical devices are managed. And so I put some pictures showing that there are very different technical devices, very different ways to manage these devices. Okay, next. Next. And okay, and there's another issue here, but in many developing countries and even in developed countries, which is the quality of water. How do you take the quality of water into account? And how do you consider water as a common good if you do not introduce the quality of water as a key issue? So very often, well, I took this picture in Solo, in a neighborhood that you know probably, which is La Huellan, where there are all these batik industries. And these industries say that they are very careful about water. And then when you just walk a little bit further, you can see all the colors which are used for batik and which are put in the river. And then when you go and do some interviews in the people houses, you can see that they use the water of the river or the groundwater, which is also polluted to drink, for instance. Okay, next. So what does it mean then that water is considered as a right? As you saw, in this all the economic framework, water was not and is not considered as the right. But in Indonesia, in the law process, this is the argument that was stressed out, so that it was an important one to consider water as a human right. And this was the UN resolution of 2010. But this resolution is just a resolution of the UN, and there is no sanction if you don't respect it. But it was a very important process, and it was a mobilization of the civil society to have this right, which was mentioned as a resolution at the UN. So it was a very important step. But even if sometimes you have this right to water in constitution of countries, there is no sanction if you don't respect it. And there are some scholars, very interesting scholars, who consider that water is an hydrosocial complex system. What does that mean? That means that you don't have to spend all that time, what I did, to explain what is water qualification. That this is not the key point. The key point is really to understand how water, people, nature interfere and are always together, and how the way you choose a water management system is a way to define your society. The link you have with nature is a way to define the way you are in the society. And that this is not qualification of water which is important, but the nature of relationship and power in a society. So these are very interesting works today in radical political ecology. And this is a new, a kind of new scholars working on these issues. So with one of them with Jamie Linton. Okay. I don't know. Est-ce que j'ai beaucoup de temps encore? 10 minutes. Okay. Thank you. So, next. The conclusion is that referring only to an economic perspective, as I did at the beginning, denies the political dimension of water governance. But I think it's important to be conscious of this. Water governance is a political choice. It has nothing to see with economic issues only. And what Linton says is, water is what we make of it. And I took this quotation because I found it very interesting. What I can say also is that in the legal text in Indonesia, well, water as a common good is never mentioned. So you're talking about public good, you're talking about social good, but you're not talking about common good. And as I show you at the beginning, it's not the same. So this is interesting to just be wondering why. And I don't have the answer. Okay, I have a second part. Then maybe I just, I won't take too much time on this one. Okay, next. What I just wanted to show you is that until the SDGs in 2015, water as a resource and water as a service were completely disconnected. Whether you had this big issue on water resources management, or you had all these debates about water as a service. But the two were separated. And one of the main points was during the International Conference of Dublin. I think it's really the key point where at the international level, they decided that water was to be treated as a private good, a commodity. And this impacts a lot of resolutions, a lot of laws, a lot of fights against water. And from this period, there were all these debates on the PPP approach, but also on integrated water management, which is one of the French models to manage resources at the basin level. Okay, next. I think that what is interesting in the SDG, for the first time, they tried to connect water resource management with service management. So this is quite interesting to note. I don't know what this will be, how this will be really implemented at national or local levels. But it's they tried to connect the two, and it was the first time. So that's why I think that it was a kind of new paradigm concerning water issues. Okay, next. So water as a common is not at the core of the international agenda, even if Ostrom got the Nobel Prize in 2011, but it's not. It doesn't appear, and we don't talk about water as a common resource. Even if the French Development Agency has this new paradigm for development, which is development as a common. So maybe this will lead to some modifications in considering water as a common. I don't know. They tried to do a lot of lobbying with the World Bank specifically. And international forums and NGOs often claim a right to water, and sometimes they make the confusion between right to water and common resource, which is not the same. So that's why I took some time to explain what is common per resource. Okay, next. So this is the more difficult for me part, which is about the law, the Indonesian law. What did I want to do here? I just wanted to explain to you, not the law, because you know probably the law much better than I do, but just trying to read the law with these debates on water qualification. So next. Okay, I just tried to figure out, since the Constitution of Indonesia, with this very important article, as you know, referring to water issues, and to the cancellation, the law which was enacted in the 2004, the cancellation of the law, and today with these big debates on the new law, new water law. So next. So the law, I will focus on the law of 2004 on water resources. What does this law, how did I interpret the big key issues of the law? First one it was very important, this law, because it enables water uses rights. So this was a very important point. The second one is that it refers to integrated water resource management, which was also an important one. It was also in the context of decentralization. So it was giving more power to local governments in water management. And then it was also very important, and then you know that, because it's kind of institutionalization of the role of private actors in the water sector in Indonesia. So these 4 key points for me, it's a way to read the law, of course, and you can choose many others way. But I think this is... so what I'm wondering is what is new from these different key points? What is new in the law, the new law of 2017? I've not read the new law because it's in Bahasa. I couldn't find a translation in English until now, but I have some slight informations, so I'm going to try to go further with you. Okay, next, please. I've tried to take this point, the 4 points I introduced, and then just to show that there was an innovation in water qualification in the law, according to all I explained before. Okay, so from the water uses rights point of view, what was very interesting for me? It was a difference between what they call in the law profitable water uses right, for instance, for industry, for big farmers, and non-profitable water uses right. This is the first time I can see that in a law. In my fieldwork in Africa, I don't find these kind of issues. So it was quite interesting to see this difference between profitable and non-profitable. But there was no hierarchy between water uses, as it was in the law of 1974, between, you understand, because between all the users. The other point was that different licenses were given according to the water qualification. So you can find what I say about water qualification in Indonesia and the debates on surface water and groundwater. So this also was an important point. And another point, which is one of the, I think, one of the problems here, is that there are different ministries who are involved in water use rights management. So there's sometimes a lack of coordination. Private sector participation, also a very, very large amount of private stakeholders, and the difference between water services. Between water services and water resources. And this is also one point of the debate I'll explain after. And also different governance mode involving private actors like PPP, privatization, as I said before. So you can find here in the law all the debates I mentioned on a theoretical point of view in my first part. And then about integrated water resource management. In fact, here in Indonesia, there is a kind of restricted interpretation of the principle of IWRM because they only focus on river territories and not on groundwater, which is different if you consider integrated water resource management in the literature. And then, of course, it's connected with the decentralization process. There is another very important issue about tax collection. Who collect the tax? Because it's the key issue for local authorities, of course. Next. So what I tried to do is to have a look at the controversies of the water law according to 2 things: qualification of water as economic good, common, or human rights, and secondly, the status of spring water resources, surface water, and groundwater. And I think it's very interesting to look at the law according to these 2 main points. Next, and this will be my last and more difficult slide, just to explain. Hop, faire un show. Okay, what I tried to do is just to start from this loan of the World Bank, who was the starting point of all the debates on water issues. It was in 1999. And then the promulgation of the law, as you know, in 2004. After 2004, you have the Supreme Court decided that the law could come into force under certain conditions. Then they decided. But there was a contest, a very high contest. Between 2011 and 2014, there was a kind of mediatization of this context. And I think that during this time, civil society was very proactive in the contestation. And this led to the cancellation of the law in 2015. After this cancellation, there was a kind of lobbying. It's a way we read it. It can be very different from your point of view. I do agree. We are researchers, and I'd be very happy to discuss this with you. After 2015, there was a kind of lobbying to contest this cancellation, and new transition law, which are the laws that are now in reference with these days, as I said, a new law, which is just a draft of a new law, which is not still promulgated. So what I tried to do here is to see the key actors of all these protests, who was involved in all these different steps of the law. And you can see that civil society gets organized at these different steps of the law, which is very interesting for me. Because, for instance, in Africa, I cannot see all this organization. The only country is South Africa, but I don't work in, and it's apart. But in all these West African, you cannot see all these kind of organizations. So this is very interesting, the way civil society decided to fight against these different proposals, let's say like this, and how at different steps, the private association or private actors decided to counteract all the decisions that were made. So I've tried to read all these steps through the roles of all these key actors. But, well, this is quite easy. But what I tried to do is to look how water was considered as these different steps, which means how do people use some discourses to legitimate their action? And for instance, it's clear that in this step of the World Bank loan, and you can see it, we read the text, etc., water was an economic good. And I mentioned that in the 1990s, it was the context of PPP and all this. And so it was completely in adequation with international consideration about water. But the debate, as I told you, according to civil society, water should be considered as a human right or as a public good. But they didn't mention as a common good. So they decided to fight on human rights or public goods, which is, from my point of view, was not maybe the right way to discuss this. Then, when the law was promulgated in the law, well, it was obvious that water was considered as a private good, and the private sector was able to manage water. When the law was cancelled, the fight was once again on water as a human right and a public good. And you can see, or social good, because there was confusion between public and social. And you can see that, once again, common was not mentioned at all. When there was a contest with the contest of industries and private bottling associations and also foreign industries, in fact, they didn't refer to water qualification. So this is also very interesting. This was not their point. Their point was most on discriminatory commercial rules. They said it was unfair that they were excluded of this market. But they didn't discuss water qualification. And in new transition law, we come back to water as an economic good. with what is interesting, they come back to the hierarchy. I told you about the former law, about hierarchy in water uses. And drinking water was one of the first main use that was prevailed by the law. Ask, okay, where do we go back? Do we go back to water as a right, as a social good, as a common good? So what I heard about this law is that we are focusing on water as a right again, but I'm not sure. I didn't read the whole text right now. What I tried to do also on the last, at the bottom of the slide, is to see the debate between spring water and surface water and groundwater. As I told you, the debates was moving all along. At the beginning, until 2005, there was the distinction was not a key issue. So this has a great impact on quality of water. But then there was a shift, and spring water was at the core of the debate, of the contest. And then, again, with the transition laws, we can see that spring water was considered as surface water. So each time it's very interesting, because when you have these enterprises who are using surface water, there was a debate on what is surface water, in fact, and what is groundwater. Where does the water come from? And it has to see with permits, with taxes, and all this. So it's a very important issue. And so in the law now, I think that they focus more on spring water, but once again, I have to have more information on this. Okay, so we tried to read this from all these points of view, and we tried to discuss the law, and we are very, very eager to see what is the new law, and also about Jakarta, because there is a big deal on these issues these days. Okay, next, and it will be the last one. So, conclusion. There is a debate, and there has always been this debate. For civil society, water governance must remain public, but what does public means? What does public means? Is it, no, so it refers to what I said at the beginning. Public doesn't mean only managed by public authorities, okay? So there is a kind of, it's quite problematic. And for public and private actors here, at least, there is a kind of hybrid governance with public-private partnerships, and I don't think that this is discussed, but I can be wrong. What is interesting also, who regulates conflicts? Is it at the national level, or are the conflicts regulated at the local level? And what does mean local? Is it community level, local authority, public authorities, or some private actors who are at the local level? And my question is, what's next in the new law? Thank you very much.